Hello, my name is Laurel, and today I'm here to talk with you about standards alignment. And I know that for a lot of us, we teach classes that have standards that we need to follow in order to help our students be successful on their tests and be able to pass their courses. And for a lot of us that teach those kinds of classes, we feel like we don't have a whole lot of extra time to add on something new, like an invention or research project. And today I'm here to urge you to think of invention and research less as something that's an extra thing to add on to your already very busy schedule, and more of a new way to teach the things that you're already teaching. You're going to be covering the same content, but you're just taking a new approach. If you are at all familiar with project-based learning or problem-based learning methods and pedagogies, then this process of standards alignment should feel pretty familiar to you. And if this is something brand new that you've never tried before, give it a chance. Try getting your feet wet and giving it a go, and maybe you'll find a brand new way of teaching your content in a way that is engaging for students and rewarding for you. Now let's get started. Good news is that you don't have to start from scratch if you don't want to. If you follow NGSS standards or Common Core standards, Invention Convention has already aligned their curriculum K through 12 to those standards. So you can go on their website, on the InHub website, and you can access all of those curricular materials for free, and you're ready to go. Plug and play, and you've got the standards already identified for you, so you can bring those to your administrators or you can align them with your unit plans. However, if you have your own state standards that you need to follow, then this is a technique that I have used myself as a former state-tested biology teacher in order to break down this process into 7 steps for aligning your standards for your content to a project that you can do with your students. I have included a resource for you below that you should go ahead, click, and follow along as we go through these steps to make it a little easier for you as you're listening. The first step is to identify the key points that you want this invention or research project to teach your students. Remember that this is not instead of teaching the content, it's a way to teach the content through invention and research. So first you have to identify, okay, which part of my content is going to be covered in this project. It could be a full year-long experience if you want it to be, but I find that it's easier to start with a smaller chunk, and then you can work your way up to a larger scale project. So choose the key points that you feel will lend themselves best to a project like this, that you can think about a way that students will be able to learn these key points through this project. If you have a unit plan already provided for you or created by you, go to that unit plan, identify those key points. Otherwise, go to your standards for your content and break those standards down into more discrete pieces of knowledge or skills that students will be able to know and do, or should be able to know and do by the end of the project. Once you've decided on the key points that you would like this project to cover, then you're ready to move on to step 2. Now that you've identified some key points that go together, make sense together, it's time to identify a real-world connection that you can make to those key points. What is something that your students experience in their everyday lives? What is something that's affecting your local or global community? And what kind of careers might actually use these key points? Think through those things and brainstorm possible research questions or problem statements that align to this real-world connection. You're going to want to have your students, of course, once they're doing the project, identifying those problems and questions themselves. However, it is incredibly helpful for you to go through this process yourself so that you can feel it from the student perspective. Also, so that you can have a bit of an idea of the kinds of directions your students might go in, and also so you can maybe give some helpful hints if your students are feeling stuck. So find that real-world connection. The next step is to continue doing it yourself. So actually come up with an experiment to test that research question or a possible solution to that problem that you identified. And I know it might feel like a lot to do up at the beginning, up front, but doing it yourself will once again give you the opportunity to identify any spots where your students might get stuck. It'll also make it easier to do all the rest of these steps because you will have experienced it yourself. If you have the capacity to do the experiment or build a prototype of a possible solution, I highly encourage you to do it. That will also give you a better idea for what kind of materials your students might need and so forth. However, it might also be easier for you as you're doing this. You might realize, maybe actually part of the challenge for students is that we only have access to these materials, right? So it can really help shape what this can end up looking like in your classroom by you taking the time to do it yourself, or at least coming up with a plan of how you would do it yourself. Once you've done it yourself or thought through the steps of how you would do the experiment or build a prototype yourself, next, think through what resources did you look up as you were trying to find out information, right? What kind of resources did you need? What kind of materials did you need? Who are local experts that you or your students would contact or could contact to find more information? Perhaps there's some sort of interview assignment that you could come up with, right? For how students can interview family members or friends or community members who are impacted by this problem. Think through how your students are going to gather information. And honestly, this part right here, in large part, is how your students are going to hit on those key points that you identified earlier in that first step, right? Think through how are your students going to find the information that meets those knowledge key points. How are they going to practice the skills that meet those skills-based key points? And that's really what this step is about. How are your students going to build their knowledge about this problem or this research question in a way that also enables them to learn the content? And this should be something that is as student-driven as possible. You absolutely can supplement with some lectures here and there if you feel like that's what's needed, but I highly recommend that you think through resources that students can find and access themselves to encourage this to be as student-driven of a process as possible. And maybe what this also looks like is teaching your students about how to distinguish between trustworthy sources and not trustworthy sources. In fact, I would highly recommend that you have that kind of conversation with your students. But also it could look like you providing them with articles that you've already found if you want to meet some specific literacy standards. It could look like I said before, like interviewing experts. There's a lot of different resources that students can access. You need to think through, what do those resources look like for your students? What works best for you in your classroom? Okay, by this point, you've figured out the key points that you want to hit in this project. You've figured out a real-world connection. You've done it yourself, or at least made a plan for how you would do it yourself. You've thought through what resources your students will need to access in order to do it. Now, time to put all of that into a calendar. What sequence makes the most sense? Especially when you're thinking about helping your students understand the research question or problem more deeply, what order makes the most sense for them. It could look like the same order that you've normally done it in. It might be that your unit calendar doesn't change at all. It's just that your students are learning those key points in a new way. Or it could be that actually when they're trying to figure out a way to design an experiment or a prototype, it actually needs to be flipped around a little bit. Go back to that plan that you made or executed during your do it step on step 3 and think through what order makes the most sense. Then organize the key points into that order as well as the resources that students will need to access into that order. And now you've got a unit calendar for your invention and research project. Now, something that can feel a bit different or even kind of scary about these student-driven projects is that you might have a little bit less of an idea of how well your students are understanding the material unless you build in formative assessments along the way. What do I mean by that? Well, you created some steps in the previous step. You created a calendar of steps in the previous step of this process. And what I loved to do was then take that calendar and create a rubric based on those steps. And then have some sort of formative assessment for each step along the way so that you are getting those check-ins with students and assessing their understanding, and you can then schedule different check-ins with individual students or small groups, or maybe you need to re-explain a concept whole class, and you have a way of knowing when you need to do that. Now, what those formative assessments look like is up to you. So for me, I really liked students to be able to go at their own pace, and my students gave me feedback that they also appreciated being able to go at their own pace with the projects. And so I liked using online tools like Socrative or ProProfs that we don't need to schedule time in class whole group, and instead students can take those formative assessments as they complete the different steps of the project. And then I'm able to see how they're doing. They always showed me, especially if it was something that didn't give me the grade directly, I would make it a requirement that they need to get my signature. They need to show me their ProProfs quiz score and then get my signature before they can move on to the next step. And that is a great way to do it. Particularly if students are going at their own pace. However, you can also just have standard paper and pen. I've also done this. I made it to where it was a requirement that students finish a certain step by a certain day, and then on that day we had a little quiz or exit ticket that would demonstrate their understanding of the content as they were doing the project, also holding each individual one of them accountable to learning the content along the way, especially if it was a group project. And so that was something really helpful too, is to also have those paper and pen quizzes or exit tickets. You can continue even using the same ones that you've been using because they should be learning the same content just in a new way. And this way, assessments are able to act as checkpoints. So you also have an idea of where students are in their project and also where they are in their understanding of the material. I did not always use the formative assessments as formal grades, particularly those online ones. However, a lot of the paper and pen ones I did actually use as grades in my grade book. So you could go either way. I would caution that if you are using those online ones, though, just know that, of course, students additionally have access to other resources as they're doing it. It's a less controlled environment. So keep that in mind if you're going to be making it something other than a completion grade. But I cannot overstate the importance of creating formative assessments so that you're able to monitor your students' progress as they go through the project. Guess what? We've made it to the final step! Yay! So you've already created your key points, you've created a plan, a calendar plan, you've done it yourself so that you had a more informed idea of what that calendar should look like and what the resources students will need should look like, and you've created formative assessments to assess their progress along the way. final piece, putting it all together in some sort of package for your students to access. I personally created printed project packets and used online slide decks like Google Slides or eMaze or Nearpod, something like that. But you could use one or the other or both. Just something where all of this is in one spot for them to access. And I learned over time, because at first I didn't do this, I learned over time that keeping everything in one spot, that could also be a Canvas page if that's what you have, but keeping everything in one spot is really helpful for making sure that students know exactly what they need to be doing, and it's great for holding them accountable to that, and also just reducing confusion and shuffling of different papers and things all over the place. Put it together in one spot for students to be able to know what they should be doing and how to access what they need. Now, this is, I want to name, a lot of upfront work. You are basically creating your lessons for the entire unit all at the beginning. That's not to say that you can't make tweaks here and there along the way, but it is doing a lot of prep up front. However, that investment of time at the beginning comes in such help, pays out so many dividends, if you want to use that metaphor, later when you are actually facilitating these lessons. One, because it puts students in the driver's seat. You've already done all of your work ahead of time to set them up for success, and so then they can take it and run with it. And so it makes it to where you don't have to be up at the front doing direct instruction nearly as often, which frees up more time for you to do individual check-ins or targeted support for students who need it. It also frees up time for you to do grading when you need to. It frees up time for you to have meaningful interactions with students and relationship building in a way that feels really authentic, where you just get to ask them about their project and what they're excited about, rather than trying to manage the classroom in a direct instruction kind of way. And it just makes it a much more productive learning environment where you also have a lot of freedom to get things done that you need to get done during that classroom time, and make those adjustments along the way. So I cannot recommend enough putting this all into a single packet, whether it's a virtual packet or physical packet, for your students to access, because that frees up a lot of time for you later on. And as I mentioned before, what that packet looks like is entirely up to you and what works best for your students. It could be a physical packet that you printed out. It could be slide decks online like Google Slides or eMaze or Nearpod, and I'm sure there's others as well. Those are just the ones that I've used. It could be a Canvas course page that you have that students can then click through to get to the different steps of their project. It really could look like anything, and it's just up to you and what resources you have and what resources work best for your students to access. And once you have that project packet made, you're good. You're good to go. Then it's just about checking those formative assessments along the way and checking in with students and their projects and making sure that you're giving that extra help where they need it, and that you're able to be a cheerleader essentially for this entire unit for them, which is really exciting and so rewarding. And honestly, it saved me a bunch of energy. It was much more sustainable for me to teach this way compared to the traditional direct instruction way that I had been doing previously. And that's it. We're done. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video and taking the time to think through how you can adjust the way you teach so that you're still covering the same content while providing an experience for your students that is a real authentic learning experience that is engaging and rewarding for both you and them. Definitely take a look at the resources that I've put below. Use that standards alignment template to help you get started, and feel free to reach out if you have any additional questions. I hope you have a great rest of your day. Bye now.